rise and collapse of complex societies with the School of Advanced Studies, the University of Tyumen. Today's lecture, we're very honored to have Denis Sharapov, who will be talking about complex societies, the rise and maybe not the fall of complex societies in the Bronze Age in the Southern Urals. Further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Denis.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Hopefully all of you guys can hear me and see me. If there are any problems, then raise your hand or attract my attention somehow if you cannot hear me or if we're having a bad connection. So I'm glad to be here with you. Hopefully you guys will enjoy the talk. I think it's directly related to the theme of your course, to the theme of your class. So what I'll do, I'll read the first part of the lecture. And then I'll see if you guys have any questions. We'll kind of go into the discussion mode. And, you know, once we go over the questions, if there's more time left, I'll talk about my research some more. So if you guys have any questions that emerge during my talk, then kind of keep them in mind and ask me the questions later when I'm done with the first part of my talk. So let me go ahead and begin. I researched the emergence and development of complex societies. But I think I do it in a way that's a little different from how you guys have been approaching this topic in this course. And here's what I mean. For a lot of people, states, государства in Russian, are the early complex societies. And to study the emergence of social complexity, people study the emergence of states. But if we look at the actual characteristics, at the actual individual features of social complexity, we'll see that in a number of cases, they emerge much earlier than states do, hundreds of years earlier, sometimes thousands of years earlier. So, for example, if we look at the Zapotec state of Monte Alban, one of the first, if not the first, primary pristine state in the region of Mesoamerica, we'll see that things like monumental architecture, elite households, centralized regional polity, these things, they existed for a few centuries before Monte Alban emerged. And for me, what's more interesting than the emergence of Monte Alban state is this initial transition from people living in small scattered villages, like you see in my slide here, in these types of houses, you know, in villages that contain maybe 10 families each, to living in a more complex way, basically living in a regional polity. And that's the same exact region where Monte Alban later emerged. And this polity was centered on the site of San Jose Mogote with monumental architecture. And you see the remains, the remnants of this monumental architecture in this picture right here. So why and how, you know, did people, after living in scattered small villages for 800 years or more, go to living in this more complicated way, to living in a centralized polity, you know, that includes about 30 villages. So, you know, if I was teaching an early complex societies class, I would probably be looking at this time period as the sort of most interesting time period in this regard, in this Mesoamerican region. So another example is if we take Mesopotamia as a region, the earliest states emerged there at about 3800 BC in the Uruk period. And here in my images, you see the remains and the reconstruction of one of these very early cities of Uruk. Again, if we look at the earlier period, we'll see that things like monumental architecture in the form of temples, chiefdom level polities, these basic political units, hereditary wealth differentiation, they emerge 1,000 or 1,500 years before the Uruk period. So, for example, if we look at the site of Eridu, which is one of the more famous sites, the temple there was beginning to be constructed way earlier than the Uruk period. So actually, a lot of these early construction phases, they date to the preceding Ubaid period. And these temples, they served as storages for grain and also redistribution centers for grain. And understanding this period is key to sort of understanding the, again, emergence of social complexity in the region of Mesopotamia. So what I actually do, as opposed to studying the emergence of states, I study the emergence of the individual characteristics of social complexity. So I break down this definition into the individual characteristics, and you guys see the slides from your course. Hopefully this will be a little bit of a review, where you went through different definitions, and there are many more definitions and criteria and characteristics of complex societies. So I take these criteria and basically study their emergence. When do they emerge for the first time? And these types of societies where some of the characteristics of social complexity are present, they're called early complex societies in some archaeological literature. They're also called chiefdoms, rank societies. So this is the scale of analysis that I study that's most interesting to me, societies of this type. And let me talk about first my region sort of from a broader perspective. It's the Eurasian steppes, and this region should be familiar to all of you guys because it's located just south of us. And I believe actually some pockets of the steppe actually penetrate into the Tyumen district, into the Tyumen Oblast. And this is this broad, ecological zone, basically, of arid grasslands that stretches through the middle of the Eurasian continent. And I work kind of in the middle of it. And here in these pictures, you see actual photographs from my research area taken from a drone, also just from the ground. So, you kind of have a feel of what kind of landscape we're dealing with here. So when we look at the Eurasian steppes, what are the very early marks of social complexity that we see, and what period do they date to? So we'll probably be looking at the Bronze Age period. So researchers agree that, we need to talk about the Bronze Age here, roughly from the 3rd to the 2nd millennium BC. And what we see in the sort of central and western part of the steppe are these kurgan burials, these burial mounds. And in these burial mounds, sometimes we see individuals buried with quite elaborate burial goods. Some of these individuals are children, which is traditionally interpreted as a sign of hereditary social inequality, because these children couldn't have reached a high status during their lifetime. They couldn't have been a successful hunter or herder or a warrior. And when we look at the eastern part of the steppe in Mongolia during the Bronze Age, we see these stone monuments that are called kiriksurs. And some of them are pretty colossal. One of them is about 400 by 400 meters, about 4 meters tall. And they occur in different kind of stone arrangements. Sometimes they contain burials of humans, sometimes they don't. So these are clearly ceremonial sites, and they are interpreted as these previously scattered herder communities beginning to integrate at a larger scale. When we look at the settlement evidence, so I've discussed sort of the burial and the ceremonial evidence. But if we look at the settlement evidence, there isn't much discussion of settlement hierarchies, of urbanization, sort of discussions that we would expect to see in other regions where complex societies emerge. We don't see much of that discussion in the steppes. And the traditional sort of justification for that is, we're dealing with herder populations, with pastoralist populations, whose main source of calories come from herding domestic animals. And we know from the ethnography, we know from history that herder populations usually live in small groups, and they move around quite a bit to allow enough grass and water for their herds. And therefore, this discussion of sort of the settlement patterns is quite limited. So For my research, I focused on the Sintashta archaeological culture of the Middle Bronze Age. So it dates to, roughly 4,000 years ago. You can see the dates on the slides. The location of it is on the border between Russia and Kazakhstan, and actually some of these sites penetrate into Kazakhstan, across the border. And what this archaeological culture is characterized by is kurgan burials, and we'll talk about them in a minute in more detail. But we also see 22 fortified settlements that are quite compact, quite small, and you see some of their pictures taken from the air, mostly during the Soviet era. Some of them are circular, some are more sort of square-like in shape. So these settlements are nucleated, they're compact. Some of them exhibit signs of quite complex spatial organization. So if you look at this, probably the most famous settlement of Arkaim, you can see shared house walls laid out in a sort of concentric arrangement. You also see an open central plaza, sort of an open central square in the middle. And this society has been labeled a chiefdom, has been called a chiefdom in various archaeological publications. Probably one of the earliest societies to receive that label, one of the earliest cases of independent chiefdom emergence in this region. And why has it been called a chiefdom, right? Why are we talking about it? Why do we consider it an early complex society? The first reason is because of hereditary social inequality. That's apparent when we look at these kurgan burials, and some of these kurgan burials are very fancy. They contain burial goods like bronze weapons. You see this axe here as an example, jewelry. They also contain these sort of lavish animal sacrifices. And when I say animal sacrifices, I mean these animals were not consumed. You can see that there are whole skeletons of these animals. They were deposited whole into these graves, which kind of signifies a great expenditure of resources, because sometimes we find up to 30 animals deposited in a single grave. And even if you go to a village today and try to buy 30 horses or 30 cows, you're going to spend a lot of money. And back then, we know it was a lot of value to these people because for pastoralist societies, their livestock is their everything. We also see entire chariots buried in these kurgans. And we'll talk about chariots in just a minute. Looks like only a certain portion of a society was buried that way. So according to my sort of rough calculations, about 4 to 7% of these people were receiving this kind of burial treatment. And some of these people again, are children. So by at least, the majority of researchers, that's interpreted as a sign of hereditary social inequality, which in turn is a sign of social complexity. Another feature of Sintashta that we need to talk about is this labor investment into public works projects. So a public works is something that's built for the use by the entire community, by the larger community. So here we can talk about the defensive structures. For example, the fortified walls, they were about 4 meters thick, 2 to 3 meters tall. These moats or ditches dug around the fortified settlements for defense purposes, roughly about 2 by 2 meters. Also, when we look at the kurgan structures, there was quite a bit of labor that went into constructing those. And these kurgan structures served as public monuments and areas where people engaged in ritual activity, and larger community, maybe even a few of these communities engaged in feasting and different types of other ritual behavior. And we may also consider that these kurgans had to be built in a short period of time. So if a person dies, you're not going to build his burial over a month. You'll need to do it in a day or two. probably, before the body starts to decompose. So when we're talking about public works, these are not, the Egyptian pyramids by any means, but we need to consider that these communities were very small demographically. So we're talking about only a few hundred people living in each one of these fortified settlements. And when you consider that some of these people are children, older people, there aren't that many able workers to basically do all of this labor that I have just mentioned. The third, probably sort of one of the most interesting aspects of Sintashta that points to social complexity is the development of craft technologies, which kind of indicates at least some level of craft specialization within these communities. And here we can talk about two different areas of activity, one being metallurgy. So Sintashta society comes up with new types of bronze weapons, and they just generally advance this practice of metallurgy in the region. And the other area of activity is has to do with transportation technology or warfare technology, depending on how you want to look at it. And here we need to talk about chariots. These are the earliest chariots in the world. They date to 2000 BC. They predate chariots in Greece, in China. Looks like this technology was invented here, or at least in this general region. You see here the remnants of the actual spoked wheel in one of the graves. Here you see a reconstruction of these chariots. And together with these chariots, we see the development of sort of horse riding or horse directing technology. These things that you see here in the middle of the slide are called psalia. And these are basically made out of bone, and they help you direct the horse while you're riding a chariot. They put pressure on the horse's cheeks, and they're a part of this more complex bridle and bit equipment. And here you see a horse skull found in one of these graves with these psalia still embedded in the skull. And we don't know exactly where these psalia were invented, but they definitely were invented in the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere in the southern Russian and southern Ukraine steppes. Another thing that's very interesting that is going on in Sintashta is large-scale feasting. By large scale, I mean, here you see a picture. That's a picture of the excavation of one of the sacrificial or ritual pits excavated on the side of one of these kurgan structures. And here you see bones of various domestic animals. And according to the calculations of zooarchaeologists, that represents about 2.7 tons of meat, eaten probably, if not in a single sitting, then in a short period of time. And here you see a ceramic pot, a huge ceramic pot, sort of ritually turned upside down. And that's all part of this ritual deposit that, is a great example of what feasting looks like for an archaeologist. And, in anthropology, these feasting activities, they're usually associated with individuals or groups of individuals fighting for social status, fighting for prestige, establishing their prestige and their authority in the society. And it looks like quite a bit of that was going on in the Middle Bronze Age in the southern Ural steppes. So in my dissertation, I try to answer a few different research questions, but I will talk about just one of them because it relates most directly to your guys' course. So one of the unusual sort of characteristics of Sintashta was that after existing for a fairly short period of time, for about 300 years, this society collapses, or at least that's how it's been framed in the archaeological literature. And this notion of collapse is basically based on two lines of evidence. One comes from the settlement pattern realm. These types of fortified nucleated settlements disappear and populations disperse and start living in smaller communities that are sort of scattered through the landscape. And, these villages may contain a few extended families, something like that. Another line of evidence that allows archaeologists to talk about collapse is the simplification of the burial ritual. So we don't see these elaborate fancy burials anymore. We still see kurgan burials, so people are still buried under kurgans. Still just a small minority of the society is buried that way, but the burials are becoming not as fancy. So for example, instead of sacrificing entire animals, people may sacrifice just the head and the hooves of a horse, or they may sacrifice just pieces of meat instead. So one of the objectives of my research was to, I decided to investigate sort of the settlement pattern aspect of this transition. And one of my objectives was to establish the demographic and spatial scale of Bronze Age communities in different sub-periods of the Bronze Age, in both the Middle and the Late Bronze Age. And so for that, I picked one of these fortified settlements. You see them depicted as dots, as black dots on this map. Each one represents a fortified Sentashta settlement. I picked one of them. It's called Sarim Sakli. And I conducted a systematic regional survey around this settlement. And I covered an area of about 40 square kilometers. And my goal was to detect, delineate, and date all of the occupation areas that date to different sub-periods of the Bronze Age. And so after doing that, what I found is that this Middle to Late Bronze Age transition was not a collapse. And the reason why I can say that confidently is because I found that the regional population actually increased quite a bit. It quadrupled in size. And depending on whose definition of societal collapse you look at, most people are talking about a substantial and sudden reduction in human population. And we definitely don't see that here. We see population increase. And another thing that we see is that supralocal organization that for the first time appears in this region in the Middle Bronze Age continues into the Late Bronze Age. And what I mean by the emergence of supralocal organization is this process where people begin to live in these settlement clusters or districts that are separated from each other by empty buffer zones. And it happens as a result of these sort of centripetal forces. And you guys have mentioned this concept in your course also. People are attracted to certain central places. Maybe these central places are fortified settlements, maybe ceremonial sites, maybe large villages. And so people try to be close to these central spots. They try to crowd around sort of these central locales within the landscape. And this type of settlement pattern is considered a marker of a more complex social organization, because various processes, for example, that have to do with conflict resolution or collective decision making, they begin to happen not only at the local level, at the level of individual villages, but also between individual villages that are included in such clusters. And so this kind of a settlement pattern continues into the next period, into the Late Bronze Age. But the nature of the centripetal forces that pull people together changes to where in the Middle Bronze Age, these forces had to do with warfare and security and safety. What I think was happening is these sort of peripheral, smaller settlements ran to the fortified settlement for defense in times of danger. In the Late Bronze Age, these people settle around larger unfortified villages for different reasons. They do that maybe for purely social or economic purposes. They may be pulled to these larger villages to, communicate with their relatives or just exchange information with people or to engage in economic exchange. So the nature of that interaction becomes different. It becomes more peaceful. Fortifications disappear in the Late Bronze Age, and these clusters of settlements, they begin to be located closer to each other. So we don't see these huge buffer zones of sort of dead man zones, where no one lives, people are interacting more in the late Bronze Age. So it looks like it's not a collapse, but a sort of transition to a different type of lifestyle, to a different type of society. And the burial evidence coincides with that quite nicely, because we see a reduced focus on these warrior elites. We don't see that anymore. So I think social stratification still exists in the late Bronze Age, but it's just less pronounced than before. And, my conclusions were very different from how people viewed this transition before my research. And I'd like to talk about some reasons why my view of it is so different. And one of the reasons has to do with the methodology that I applied. Like I told you, my study was a systematic, full coverage regional survey. And the Russian archaeology that preceded me in this valley, it was focused on sites. So people sort of studied the past, the prehistory, one site at a time. And so they excavated sites. And so they said, well, these late Bronze Age sites are small, which is true. But there may be a small site, and 50 meters from it, there may be another small site, and 80 meters from it may be a third small site. And together, these small sites form pretty large human communities. But to see that, you need to carry out your study at a regional scale. You can only see certain patterns of community structure at a regional scale, and not too many people in Russia work that way. And another reason why my demographic estimates, especially for the late Bronze Age, came out much greater than what people thought was taking place before, is because of how exactly I inspected my region. I use shovel probing, systematic shovel probing. It is a very basic method, but very effective. It was never used in Russia before for some reason. Never. I was the first person to use it on a systematic scale. This method is very common in North America and a whole bunch of other countries. And so we excavated them systematically. First, we kind of hit our survey zone with this initial interval of 40 meters in order not to skip any settlements. And once we received a positive shovel probe that contained Bronze Age material, we decreased our interval to 10 meters. And we kept excavating the shovel probes in the cardinal directions and intercardinal directions until we got 2 negative probes in each direction. And what that allowed us to do, it allowed us to delineate these Bronze Age sites quite precisely in space. For example, you see an image here, we keep excavating shovel probes and we hit a positive one. We go through our pattern and we delineate this community in space quite confidently, how far, the cultural layer extended and where did it stop. And based on this data that we gathered this way, I generated our population estimates. And they're based on this notion that all other things being equal, the greater amount of people live in one space, the more garbage they will produce. And basically my goal was to quantify the amount of that human garbage that was left over by quantifying both the area and the density. And I can, talk about that more during the question and answer session if you guys would like. Why this kind of methodology was more effective than what was done before has to do also with local geomorphology. When you're looking at the Eurasian steppes, there is a lot of vegetation, a lot of grass. And the number one method in the steppes and in other regions of the world to do a regional survey is to do what's called a systematic surface collection. So people go through the landscape systematically at a certain interval, and they view and they look at the surface and see if they can see some ceramic sherds, if they can see some metal slag, lithic artifacts, maybe some archaeological features. well, some of these sites, they're pretty obscured by thick vegetation. So these pictures are taken on top of actual Bronze Age settlements. And if we conducted a surface collection, we wouldn't collect anything from these sites. So you have to penetrate that surface in order to find the Bronze Age material. And in addition to the vegetation, what happens over a few thousand years, new soil accumulates on top of the Bronze Age sites. You see two test pits that we excavated here, and you see these blackish, sort of darkish layers of soil that accumulated on top of the lighter color late Bronze Age layers. And this happens when grass and other vegetation dies every year, and it eventually turns into this organic, rich, blackish soil that's called, and this material is called humus. And this is what we're dealing with. So you need to penetrate these, 10 to 15 centimeters of newly accumulated soil to get to the ancient Bronze Age surface. And this is what I've done. And as a result of that, we've discovered new sites that were previously unknown in this region. And that's why our estimates came out greater, especially for the late Bronze Age, than what was thought before. Another reason why we got, which I think is a more accurate picture of this Bronze Age demography, is because before, what people did, they relied on these housing depressions or structural depressions to generate demographic estimates. You can see some of these structural depressions in these old Soviet-era aerial photographs taken from a plane. You can also see some of them in spatial imagery. This is high-resolution spatial imagery. You can see some of these structural depressions also. And what people did, they counted up these structural depressions and placed maybe 5 to 10 people into each house, and that's how they got their estimates. And my study showed that you cannot do that because there are additional structures that exist beyond the visible structural depressions. So what we did, we took one of these Bronze Age sites and we generated a very detailed, what's called microtopographic plan. So we measured the elevation with the accuracy of 1 to 2 centimeters all over this area. Maybe we took one measurement every 2 meters, and we saw that there are 7 structural depressions. But when we ran a geophysical transect through a part of this settlement, and by geophysical transect, I mean we employed this technology that's called magnetometry. Basically, a magnetometer measures minute anomalies in the magnetic field of the Earth, and it lets you see any kind of anomalies that exist in the sort of upper core of the Earth. So any kind of human structures, holes, hearths, things like that will show up. And here you see clearly 2 structures. One structure that's more squarish here and one more circular structure that we've detected with the magnetometer that are unassociated with structural depressions. So basically, structural depressions only show us a part of the picture, which is not really surprising because they're pretty shallow. They're about 30 to 40 centimeters deep. And when you consider that it's been 3,000 to 4,000 years, these depressions could have been very well flattened out by anthropogenic processes like constant herding, plowing, riding your car over these depressions, things like that. So going back to the sort of grand theme of my research and the sort of grand theme of this class, which is the emergence of complex societies, my study kind of supports this notion that you don't need a whole lot of people to start seeing signs of social complexity. And here we need to talk about this idea of scalar stress. Basically, it's this idea that once we take a human group and begin increasing the number of members in that group, the chances of that group reaching a consensus, reaching an agreement, they decrease exponentially. And also the amount of conflicts within that group, it increases exponentially. And at some point, this human group reaches a critical level of scalar stress. And at that critical level, this group can either fall apart and form smaller groups, or this group can remain together, but they will need to advance their structure. They will need to make their sort of social structure more complex. And one way to do that, there are a few ways to do that, but one way to do that is to establish some sort of formal hierarchy. Here it's useful to talk about some ethnographic and historical data, because, you know, at what point exactly does a human group reach that critical level of scalar stress? And there are some interesting studies of, for example, Yanomamo Indians in the Amazon region of South America, that shows that, you know, when these villages, Yanomamo villages, were growing, they would fall apart at about 200 people. So, for example, if we have a village of 200 people, instead of it growing to 400 people, it would rather fall apart into two groups, 200 people each. There is also an interesting study of Hutterites. This is an interesting Anabaptist sort of religious community in North America, kind of similar to the Amish. Maybe you guys have seen, you know, them on TV shows or in movies. So this is kind of from the same, they're not exactly the same, but similar. So these groups, they're pretty much self-governed. So they rarely go to court. They sort of settle their disputes internally, and they don't really participate in the mainstream life of the United States or Canada. And so what the researchers have noticed is that these groups, again, instead of growing to a larger size, they will fall apart and form smaller groups. And they will fall apart and fission at the size of about ranging from 120 to about 180. They will not go above 180. And when asked why that happens, these people say that when your community size increases past this point, it does not feel like a close-knit community anymore. People become strangers, is what they say. People become social strangers. And one interesting study that's worth mentioning in this regard is this study by Dunbar. And what Dunbar did, he took 38 genera of primates. And humans are primates, by the way, according to the biological classification. So he took 38 genera of primates, and he measured their neocortex size. Not the absolute size, but the ratio of their neocortex to their body size. And he also measured, well, he didn't measure, he knew that already, the size of their social groups. And he plotted those two variables on a graph, right? We see a neocortex ratio here. We see mean, meaning average group size. And he found a pretty strong correlation between the size of the neocortex, which is responsible for a bunch of functions in our brain, and the mean group size of primates. What he did then, he took humans, and he took the size of the human neocortex and plotted it on this graph as well. And what he found is that the ultimate size of a human community, sort of the natural, the biological size of a human community is 150 individuals. And so he explains it in the following way. He explains it by the limited capacity of our brain to maintain social connections. There's only so much information that our brain can store on a daily basis. And when group sizes increase past 150, people become these sort of social strangers. So what that means is, it doesn't mean that you won't recognize these people and treat them as a total stranger. You will still recognize the faces, but you won't be able to associate the face with all kinds of other information, like their personality traits, their character, their kinship relationships and stuff like that. With that, you basically start living together with people when going past this size, you start living side by side with these social strangers, and that's a different type of a community. That's a different type of social entity, different type of social animal. So we see that all of these studies agree on this sort of rough number of 150 to 200 individuals past which we may expect to see signs of elaborate, complex social structure. And that's exactly what we see in these small Sintashta communities, because, at the local scale, at the scale of a local community, a community that interacts with each other on a daily basis, we're talking about 400 people. And at a super local level, at these regional clusters, we're talking about 600 people. But yet we see clearly all of these signs of social complexity that I have discussed with you guys. So before I wrap up the first part of my talk today, I would like to say that we need to do more work in this valley, and the conclusions that I told you about in a lot of ways are sort of preliminary. What I would like to do, and that's what me and Jay were talking about, is to expand this survey to the west, because 12 kilometers this way, there is another fortified settlement just like this settlement of Sarim Sakli, is called Kuisak. And expanding this survey will allow me to get a better idea of the spatial and demographic structure of both Middle and Late Bronze Age communities. And, if any of you guys would like to volunteer, for example, and come help me, you're more than welcome to do that. Not this summer, but next summer, if the situation, with the virus becomes better, then we're definitely planning a full-on field project. And you guys are welcome to participate, or if there is anyone that would like to participate, please come join us. And for example, the last time we have actually had an archaeologist from the United States. We had an archaeologist from Colombia. So there may be an opportunity for you guys to speak English and practice your language skills. So with this in mind, I would like to wrap up my, like I said, initial lecture. And, maybe we can have a discussion and see what kind of questions you guys have.
Excellent. It's fascinating work. So thank you. Let's go ahead and open it up to the students and turn on your videos. Every once in a while I turn mine off because you started to break up a little bit. I don't know if it was my bandwidth here, but just a few words here and there. But unless it's interfering with your reception, and let's open it up for any questions.
Yeah, I raised my hand. I don't know whether you see it or not.
Yeah, no, I didn't see it. Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah, so maybe you touched that, but sorry if I didn't hear. So you said that you say that your research is somehow based on the analysis of garbage amount. Can we say that it can depend also on the changes in consumption? Like, well, I mean, people start to produce more and so on.
Yeah, this approach is definitely based on the notion that the rate of garbage accumulation does not change from one period to another, that it stays constant. So for example, if in period B, people are starting to produce 3 ceramic pots per capita, and in period A, they produced 1 ceramic pot per capita, I'll need to account for that. So that's a good question. I mean, it's just like a bunch of other methods in science and models, they're all based on some type of assumptions. And so my methodology is based on a whole number of assumptions, actually. And that's one of the assumptions. I assume that the rate of garbage accumulation stays constant. And I back that assumption up by, my overall sort of knowledge of the material culture of these two periods of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, that it looks like the ceramic production, which is my main sort of my main focus. When I say garbage, first and foremost, I mean ceramics, because that's datable garbage. That's garbage that you can date. And I'm interested in that type of garbage as an archaeologist. So it doesn't look like the ceramic production and consumption picture changed drastically going from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Artyom.
Yeah, thank you for this lecture. And well, you've said that this great method of excavations, of these area-based ones, is really good for steppes where there is this vegetation. And well, this more traditional method of just picking things up from the surface of the earth is more typical for, I don't know, deserts or like rocky landscape. Does it mean then that some areas except European steppes would need a bit more of research on them, for example, because some areas probably still have a lot of vegetation, and I guess not all of them, not all the areas that have vegetation and at the same time may be the place of the complex societies of the past have been researched with this kind of method. Yeah,
I think, that's the beauty of archaeology, that is pretty much limitless as far as its potential. There is always more work to do. There are always new methods to be applied. So we'll never run out of work to do. As far as, what specific method to apply in every specific region, we'll need to look at the specific case. We'll need to look at the geomorphology. Do we even need shovel probes there? If we're working in Chile, somewhere in the desert where there's no soil accumulation whatsoever, and stuff that is thousands of years old is perfectly fine on the surface, you don't need to excavate any shovel probes there. Surface collections are just fine. But this kind of preliminary research is necessary. You can't really just apply the same methodology everywhere you go without, accounting for the specifics, for the local specifics. And this is kind of what I try to do here. And I try to do something sort of, I don't want to say revolutionary, but something different. And a bunch of archaeologists did not like what I was doing, because that's not how they do things here. They excavate large holes. They don't excavate small holes. And so I got a lot of flack because of it. But, my data shows that it was effective. I mean, we've discovered new settlements and stuff like that. So I guess the short answer is every case is specific. You need to approach every case sort of individually and do your homework, do your background research, not only of the material culture, but also of the geomorphology of the environment. And, without knowing one, you can't really address, other questions effectively. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely critical in archaeology. If you think about like in Olduvai Gorge, where they find all the early human fossils, and they're looking for that target range, I think probably about 3 to 4 million years ago, is because you have a tectonic rift that's opened up and exposed those layers. And so they don't dig holes there. They walk around and they see what they can find on the surface, because the geomorphology, the geological history has exposed that surface. And so, it's typical in a lot of places to do just simple shovel testing when they talk about shovel testing. What you're really talking about here is you're having to go down a significant amount of distance, 80 centimeters maybe, or 60 centimeters maybe. Was that?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is that correct?
Oh, you're asking me how deep do I go down with these probes?
Yeah.
Actually, we went not that deep. We only went 40 centimeters deep. And I will explain why, because that was enough to detect the Bronze Age surface, like my studies show and the geomorphological calculations show, they won't be covered by more than 20 centimeters of soil on average. So digging 40 centimeters is more than enough. And we could, of course, dig them all the way down to the sterile soil, to where there are no artifacts and there's no soil at all. It's just clay, which is kind of what a lot of people do. But that would slow us down quite a bit and reduce the scale of my research, which was already small. 40 square kilometers is not that big of an area for a regional settlement study, because regional settlement pattern studies, usually we're talking about 100 square kilometers, which is eventually what I'm trying to achieve, at least 80 square kilometers. But that depth was definitely enough to do what I needed to do, to calculate the area and the density of that material. And actually, when you excavate in the interhouse space, which is what we were targeting, we never dug a shovel probe inside of one of these houses or anything like that. We just targeted this sort of interhouse space. And in that interhouse space, you may hit the sterile level very early. Like in the steps, the soils accumulate very slow because, for a number of reasons. So sometimes at 40 centimeters, you're at the sterile level already. So I made that choice to kind of, to choose that depth of my shovel probes after I weighed all of the pros and cons,
About how many total test pits did you put in?
Well, we excavated 7,000, close to 7,000 of probes, but those are excavated very quickly. If you consider that they're only about 40 centimeters deep, but then we excavated actual legit test pits, like the pictures that I showed you where 1 by 1 meter, 2 by 1 meter, 2 by 2 meter, we've excavated those as well. At the places where we got, at the most interesting places that we wanted to investigate some more to look at the stratigraphy and stuff like that. So we've excavated both. But, the actual probes, we excavated close to 7,000, which is a big number, but it's doable within one season, with a team of about 10 people, so it's kind of falls into that regional settlement study, labor requirement kind of a traditional regional settlement pattern study.
Did you do a sondage before you determined your methodology so you knew what you were looking at?
Well, I've actually done it in 2 seasons. So the first seasons was kind of preliminary. I mean, of course, I've done a bunch of background research, as far as reading and stuff like that. But actually in the field, I've done it in 2 seasons. So I've done 1 season. I went there and, collected off the surface, didn't really excavate shovel probes at first at all.
Yeah.
And during that preliminary season, and I also went and did field work with other people from Pittsburgh, from Britain. And within those couple field seasons, I realized that I need to do something different, that, what we're doing now is really not working. So, gradually I kind of came to this method, and a lot of it was worked out right in the field too. So for example, when I started my field research, I excavated shovel probes in a different pattern, but then right in the field, I kind of adjusted that method as I went, and came up with what you saw eventually on the screen. And part of it was, I wanted to get a good enough sample from each occupation area. Like I wanted to get at least 20 sherds. Yeah. And these people in general, they're not producing a lot of ceramics. There are some specifics of this kind of pastoralist existence that's a little different, because when I compared it to other regions like in Mesoamerica and South America, it's clear to me, these people produce bunch more pots for some reason, and so to get a decent sample, I had to excavate a bunch of probes to get at least 20 sherds, from each occupation area, because, to talk about occupation densities at different periods, you don't want to do it based on 2 shirts or 3 shirts, so all of these things, have to be considered. And at the end, I've got the methodology that you saw, on one of the slides.
Oh, I like it though. It's very neat. Good.
What I wanted to mention too is I can't really take credit for all of it, because it's kind of the principles I kind of stole or borrowed from CRM. This is your North American CRM archaeology. So I didn't invent this method. I wanted to tell the students that, but I kind of adjusted it to my research questions is what I've done,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a phase 2 survey, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Sonia.
Yeah, maybe I missed this information and you mentioned that, but still, is there any other sides of hierarchy in this society? I just think that perception of children was so different that now, and they were not participant of society at all.
Okay, so your question was, are there any other signs of hierarchy besides the burials that I've discussed, kind of, right? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a good question, because when we're talking about hierarchy, there are different kinds and degrees of hierarchies. So for example, what people would expect to find in the Santashta culture is a difference in wealth. If we excavated, for example, the settlement of Archaim that I showed you, I would expect to find one house being richer than the other house, for example, or one house being bigger than another house. So just from looking at it initially, without even knowing anything about the details of the excavations, we see that these houses look pretty similar, right? We don't see like one house being way bigger than other houses, or, just from the initial looks of it. And from the excavations that did take place, they've excavated actually almost a half of this settlement. There aren't any clear signs that jump out, any clear signs of hierarchy that jump out at us, that, they found one house that is, that has way more, jewelry or fancy pottery or something like that. And that kind of brings us to this idea of different types of hierarchy. There may be a hierarchy of wealth, but there may be a hierarchy of status. And those two don't necessarily have to coincide. So for example, a person can be respected in the society, can be of a high status in the society, but that person may be poor. So for example, some, religious leader or a monk, he doesn't have a big house, but he has a very high status. If he says something, millions of people will listen to him.
That's like a professor, right?
Exactly, like a professor. We don't have great salaries, but supposedly we have high status, but that's arguable also. So it looks like this was this type of situation, although I think we need more detailed approach even to the excavation data, because this was excavated in the 80s by a group of soldiers. Actually, they brought like a group of young soldiers who had no experience in archaeology, and there was an archaeologist directing them, but still, so that's the level of detail we're talking about here. So if we approach it with a fine comb, this view may change, but the view that exists now is, looks like these people probably enjoyed a high status, especially, this was evident at the time of their death, but in their life, I'm not sure that they enjoyed greater benefits, that they had, more resources or not. At least we don't see it in the household realm. Maybe it's expressed in some other realm, but, we see it in the burial realm. And in this sense, Santashta is not unique. I mean, there are other examples of these early complex societies of chiefdoms, just like that, where we don't see wealth differentiation necessarily within settlements, but we see great differentiation when it comes time for these people to be buried. Very clear that this one individual is buried in a way more elaborate way than the rest of them. So there had to be something special in terms of status or prestige of that individual. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a tough question. You must have looked at some analogies at like Şayunu or Çatalhöyük in Turkey, these Neolithic communities, and those would be communities of five. Do you know if there's much I know there's religious parts of the community. I don't know if there are households that have a much elevated status.
Yeah, in Çatalhöyük, I mean, that's one of the examples where I think we don't really see any clear signs of like hereditary social inequality. I was thinking more of examples from like Colombia, these more sort of obscure archaeological cultures that like not a lot of people know. I can't think of a name now, but in the sort of Alto Magdalena Valley, there are these famous sort of zoopomorphic statues, and these people are buried in these tombs with a bunch of these statues. Clearly a lot of labor went into their burials, but again, we don't see any differentiation in terms of house wealth. So that's kind of what I had in mind. But yeah, Çatalhöyük, I think, is one of those cases where it's hard to find. I mean, I haven't ran across any signs of inequality, especially hereditary, social inequality, where the same households persists for like 100 years, enjoying a higher status. And maybe if they excavated the people that are buried underneath these Çatalhöyük houses, maybe, we'll find people with rich burial goods consistently from one generation to the next. But I haven't heard anything like that. So I think that was one of the earlier villages where it never really, I guess, took place or never took hold, this kind of a hierarchical structure,
Yeah. One related question, we'll go to Artem. The burials, the kurgans, how those to the settlements, to these fortified villages? How
far, you said?
Yeah. How are they related? Are they circled around it, or is there a pattern?
So it's a complicated question, because these kurgans, they're all over the place, but we cannot date them until we excavate them. So It's like there may be 10 kurgans, but I don't know the time period that they date to. So it's hard to talk about patterns. What I've done in my research, I've plotted just settlements and kurgans, and they were kind of all over the place. I mean, I didn't see any pattern. But in this middle Bronze Age, what happens is, looks like they're in cemeteries. So they're really clustered. Like the settlements are clustered and the burials are also clustered. And they're close, and quite often they're right across the river. So like there are these small steppe rivers, there will be a settlement there. And usually, but not always, just right across the river, there will be a cemetery there. But in the late Bronze Age, it's hard. They're kind of all over the place. But I can tell you that there are a lot of kurgans in the steppes, and like in the southern Urals. I mean, there are hundreds of kurgans in my survey zone, and some of them date to the Iron Age, some of them date to the Bronze Age. This pan-Eurasian steppe tradition that's been going on for thousands of years, But to investigate those patterns would be really interesting. I mean,
are there non-kurgan burials? Do you have cemeteries where people are just buried in a hole?
Well, first of all, we don't know what happened to the rest of the people, right? Like, there's a small percentage that's buried within the kurgans. What happened to the rest? We don't know. Did they bury them? Did they just feed them to the birds, throw them in the water? There are really no solid even hypotheses about that. And actually in the earlier periods, before the Bronze Age, let's say, very rare for us to find burials in the steppe. Like, we know people lived in the steppe, but apparently they didn't bury their dead. There were some alternative burial rites. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but
yeah, no, it's good. I'm wondering, have you thought about trying to organize a large-scale geophysical survey, because the terrain's really good for it?
Yeah, I have. I'm actually looking into buying a magnetometer, but it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do, and this technology is much needed for Russia. I mean, the situation is very bad when it comes to geophysics in Russia, because mostly like good quality state-of-the-art geophysics is brought in by foreigners, by Germans, by the British, by the Americans. Locally, there are some devices that are sort of made here by geophysicists. And this is the device that I used here, the geophysics that you saw in in one of the images. That was done by a Russian guy from Yekaterinburg, and he actually made that machine himself.
Oh, really?
Right? So I mean, he's a geophysicist. It's not like he's some kind of an amateur, average Joe out there. He's a geophysicist, but still. But it was so slow. That's why you see this transect here so small, because the machine was slow. I mean, compared to other machines that I've worked with, we could have covered way more ground. So that's kind of the situation. But I agree with you that the terrain is perfect. I mean, it's perfect. Considering what's going on in the modern world, as far as geophysics, we could probably hook one up to a car and just kind of drive that car back and forth.
You could do an array on a wheeled rack, and you could cover a huge amount of area. Let's talk after in the next few weeks about this.
Okay.
And, I've got a new academic affiliation also with Cranfield, the Forensic Institute there, and let me see what they have. Maybe there's a way we can make some sort of arrangement.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I know the Brits are good at geophysics.
Oh, yeah, they're masters at it. And it's a forensic institute, so they're always interested in looking for graves. So
yeah, and this area is just begging for it. That would be.
No, it's ideal for it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Artem had a question there. And I'm going to turn it off, see if I can get the bug off my camera there. I see a big bug landed on it.
Yeah, sure. First, fun fact that evidences the ever-presence of kurgans. I'm from the place that was named after the Kurgans, Kurgan Oblast. Yeah. And the question then, it's a kind of follow-up on the question of Sonia and Jay's subsequent questions. Well, if there's so little evidences of social stratifications except for burial stuff, then is this lesser kind of structure of kurgans, lesser kind of like distribution, lesser order of kurgans, a kind of evidence for lesser social stratification, or was it something else besides that was evident for lesser social stratification in late Bronze Age here?
So yeah, like I said, there were two lines of evidence, right? One was this reduction of the elaborateness of the burials in both in terms of labor investment, right? Because to build something like this, just imagine excavating this deep hole that's about 5 meters deep, probably, and it's huge. In terms of the labor investment and in terms of just the wealth that's deposited into each burial. So that's one line of evidence. But the other was in this settlement pattern evidence. Like I said, that this way of living in these highly organized settlements, right? Because to build something like this didn't happen by accident. These people planned this out. There was some kind of system of measurements, probably. I mean, to build something like this is difficult for your house walls to be adjacent to one another, to build your houses in a concentric manner. So they planned this type of settlement out before, and it shows some kind of a centralized planning, and stuff like that. and this type of living falls apart, sort of, and people start living in these dispersed, scattered communities, right? Which was part of your question. But what I think happened is to live like this makes more sense when you're a pastoralist. Like, to live like this is more comfortable when you're a pastoralist, because if I'm a pastoralist and I have all these animals, let's say I have 15 animals, you have 15 animals, it gives us space for like corrals and barns, different structures like that. So we have a breathing room. Like, it's just a more comfortable living. So it's a question of sort of people's preference and what's better for the people. I would rather live in this type of arrangement, actually, if I'm a pastoralist, than to live like this. I'm all confined. Everyone is breathing down my neck, right? It's very crowded. There are probably diseases going on there, and stress, high levels of stress for sure. I would rather live like this. So is it a collapse? Is it, a sign of less societal organization? In a way it is, but in a way it isn't. It's just, in some ways it's better, I think. And I've just listed in what ways I think it's better. So this is a useful way to think about collapse, I think, that greater strict social hierarchy is not better always, right? It has its pluses and it has its minuses, and it works very well only in certain scenarios. So I would say it's just a different way of living. And again, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but at least partially, I think. I hope I have.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, yeah, Gregory?
Yeah, I might have missed it, but still, how did people that lived in a supra-local settlement how they were living inside this fortified structure when there were need in that? So how their life was organized? Like, did they have their secondary house in there, or was there some common living for them, like temporarily, or how did people share their houses?
Yeah, great question, actually. So what I think was happening is there were some people who lived in the fortified settlement in the center, and then there were also people who were living outside of the settlement. These populations are very small. Like, if we're talking about, let's say, 400 people here, we're talking 200 people outside. And I think at the time of danger, first of all, I think some people were away herding animals, and I mean far away, possibly, right? But at the time of danger, these people could hide and really crowd this space for a day or two. If there was like a siege or some kind of a dangerous situation, it could technically hold 600 people if everyone packs themselves into these houses and the roofs, because these houses are pretty big. They're about 10 by 20 meters each. So, and at the time of peace, they went back to live in their communities. This is what I think was happening, sort of one of the plausible scenarios. So, and that's one of the things that I sort of battled with, because I found these settlements here. But some people may say maybe, like what your question was, maybe this was like a country house of this person. For example, I had two houses. I had one house right here, and maybe 300 meters away I had like a summer house where I went and herded my animals. And I don't think that's what was happening. And I kind of list the evidence in my dissertation that I found, because at these peripheral settlements, hinterland settlements, we find evidence of all kinds of activities. So there was some craft activities going on. So it doesn't look like it was a place that was just visited. It was a place where people actually lived. Now, whether they live there a year round or not, that's a different type of very complicated question, especially when we get to pastoralists. And I can kind of talk about that a little more if we don't have any more questions, as far as how do we get at human mobility and seasonality of settlement, because that's the first round of criticisms that I hear. People say these are pastoralist communities. Pastoralists, they migrate seasonally. They don't live in one place year round. Maybe that's what was happening in your region. Did you account for that? So I can talk a little more about that if we have more time, if you guys want me to.
Let's go through a couple more questions if we have time at the end.
Okay.
Okay. Did you have more, Gregory?
Or I guess, did that answer your question, Gregory?
Actually, I meant different thing, but okay, let's heard others, and I will come up questions after.
Okay.
Okay. Artyom?
Yeah. In this part, in this section of your dissertation that Jay sent us, there was this mention of I don't know, that there were 22 or so settlements that were fortified, and that there were only 6 of them that were non-fortified. And this kind of contradicts the ideas of that centralization and stuff. But now you're saying that there was still some kind of centralization here. Maybe there was some information in the main body of the dissertation that we just weren't able to read, or some information that was after the publication phase.
Great.
Clarify on it.
Yeah, great question. Actually, so before I started my study, if you got all of the Russian local literature, it would tell you there are no hinterland settlements around Sarim-Sakli. So if they plotted the population densities, there would just be this one peak here signifying Sarim-Sakli. These settlements were unknown before my study. So the notion was that these settlements are completely centralized, that there are sort of these centers with no peripheries, right? That people lived on these islands and there was nothing in between. And when I say 6, I mean, it was strange to me that there are still 6 reports in this entire big survey zone. There were 6 reports of unfortified smaller hinterland settlements, maybe one here, one here, one here. So it didn't quite jibe well with me because, when we look at other instances of early complex societies, other instances of chiefdoms, usually they live in these type of clusters, in a super local organization. There is a center and there are hinterland settlements. And this is part of this complex social structure, where there's this kind of symmetry between the center and the periphery and stuff like that. And we do not see that here, but yet we do. There are no reports, but then there are these 6 isolated reports. So I asked myself a question, what's really going on? Let's clarify this picture. Let's go through this region with a fine brush and kind of see, are there really hinterland settlements, are there not? And I picked one of these, Sarim-Sakli, that reportedly had no hinterland settlements, but I found a few. They're just very difficult to find. And what makes it more difficult is that a lot of these settlements are multi-layered. So there may be a Middle Bronze Age layer, a Late Bronze Age layer, and the way these settlements are dated in Russian archaeology, they will dig one test pit at the entire settlement, and they will find Late Bronze Age material, and they'll say, that's a Late Bronze Age settlement, case closed. But when you dig 100 shovel probes there, you'll find all kinds of stuff, and that's exactly what I did. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, a little bit of follow-up for clarification. So then, how much of these unfortified settlements were there around Sarim-Sakli, and was this in some kind of coincidence with for example, this idea of polygons, of centralization, or not?
Yeah, there were a few. I believe there were 4, and I don't really count them by settlements. I don't count settlements. I use a different approach to where, as you can see, I plot just population densities in 3D and then look at population clusters. But I believe there were about 4 distinct occupation areas, about 4 settlements. So roughly about 400 people live here, roughly about 200 people lived on the outside. And you see how, my survey kind of drops off in this direction. I'm not even sure about, the structure of this cluster yet, because I need to go more east and see what's going on here. Maybe I'll find surprises, maybe I'll find some peaks here, but it looks like there's confidently a strict drop off here. And here's a river. That's a direction of a river. And this river goes to the next settlement. So I think there was a buffer between these 2 settlements of no man's land that was not settled. But there was this centralization going on, but it was on a very small scale. I mean, we're not talking about these, huge, powerful polities, or anything like that. But the same principles applied, only on a very small, like minuscule scale, like a minute version of a centralized sort of district or a polity. I think that's what I found. I think that's what was going on.
I want to jump back and make one comment on, you talked about the idea of having a fortified place that people could retreat into. And that's really common if you're in a place that's vulnerable to raiding or some sorts of warfare. Like we talked about Monte Alban and Oaxaca, that you find that they would have fortified sites up in the mountains. So people would retreat out of the valleys where they'd farm and go up into the hills to a fortified place. And that's where they could hold out in case there was some sort of raid or war that was going on. So in the steppes, you don't really have any sort of terrain that you can use. And so you've got to make whatever you're going to have. And that's all you have. So yeah, it's interesting to see that and to think about how the topography might relate to that sort of challenge that people have.
Yeah, exactly. One more interesting thing, I'll just jump in, is that we find wells inside of these houses. So maybe while people were held up for some period of time, or were scared that they were being held up, or maybe in the winter, I don't know. But the fact is, they had a source of water in these settlements as well.
Yeah. I had one other question. You talked about the bronze working, of course, and you mentioned that there was an open copper pit mine somewhere. Mm-hmm. But the tin would have had to have been imported from Afghanistan, right? From what Eric Klein's lecture was talking about that.
Actually, that's an interesting aspect, because here we're not looking at tin bronze, we're looking at arsenical bronze.
Oh, okay.
So it turns out there is a different kind of bronze, a different kind of recipe that was used here. It was copper and arsenic.
Yeah.
And the way this landscape is, it's southern Urals, it's just south of the Ural Mountains. And at some point, these were the mountains. It's just they kind of disintegrated and flattened out. And what it means is there are a lot of minerals right on the surface, including all kinds of different minerals, not tin, but there's arsenic, definitely arsenic and copper. So especially during these early phases, during the Sintashta time, they're not making tin bronze, but later on, they're beginning to make tin bronze. And that's when this kind of society expands eastward into Kazakhstan, where there are sources of tin, but at that time that I'm talking to you guys about, they didn't need, tin from far away places. They were pretty much self-sufficient as far as that production goes.
Were you seeing any imports in there, artifacts coming from far away?
That's the beauty of it. We don't, and people always want to find. People always want to find something from, one of these early states, you know, from the Bactria Margiana complex or from Iran and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They haven't found anything yet, and I'm happy. I'm glad that they didn't, because it shows this internal kind of capability for social complexity, you know, for me. Because you know, people would begin to make an argument, oh, this is a secondary kind of development, and it's great if it was, you know, it doesn't really matter to me, but this is a homegrown kind of a local thing, which is great for the type of approaches that I employ, kind of more processual, you know, approaches where I just take one valley and not really interested in sort of large scale migration, diffusion type of stuff, you know. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Sintashta is that we go 1,000 kilometers every which way. We won't find any early state. You know, it's just out in the steppes all by itself, no imported artifacts. They try to make an argument that there is an imported, the only thing that they found was imported was a supposedly piece of lead, I think. They found some kind of lead wire. And that's it. In excavating all of these settlements for tens of years, you know, they said, oh, this lead wire had to come from somewhere, I don't know, because there is no outcrop of lead, you know, close by. But that's the only piece of evidence. And I think that lead wire just got contaminated.
Contamination, But no obsidian or amber or anything like that?
No, they use rocks. They use, you know, regular, like high quality, like flint and stuff like that. But no obsidian in this greater region, really. You know, we're not big on obsidian here. I think we can encounter it like in very far away areas, but here, nothing really imported, even in terms of raw material. I mean, these guys were largely local. You know, there is some, especially with rocks, you know, we can trace some rocks traveling, but that's in the earlier periods, usually, you know, in the Neolithic and the Eneolithic, stuff like that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, on the secondary state formation or secondary, we have a settled community, you know, that's begins practicing intensive agriculture, and it borders on a steppe or a pastoral area where there's herders. That you have a transition where they set up communities for trading and exchanging, you know, grain and animals and things like that. But here, like we talked about before, Easter Island's a great laboratory. This is a great laboratory, you know, just surrounded in you know, terrestrially.
Yeah, and people try to link it very hard with some, you know, more complex sedentary agricultural states. But, you know, sort of the evidence is just not there. You know, like I said, we don't find evidence of like grain consumption. We don't find these foreign artifacts. And people said they must have smelted the metal and exported the metal out south. But we found that the scale of that metal production is really minuscule. I mean, it's not like they were melting kilograms and tons of copper every day. You know, they might have smelted, they might have only conducted a few smelts per year just for local use to make, you know, these bronze axes and fish hooks and whatever else they were making. But the scale of production is just not there, you know, either.
That's what's interesting about bronze production often is that level of production. I remember I was in Burkina Faso and I knew there was a lot of bronze working going on there. And so I found my way to a bronze working neighborhood, and it was just a household level. People just had a furnace in their backyard, and they were artists, and they would make bronze statues and stuff in a slum, you know, in the capital of Burkina Faso. And but yeah, there was all these. It was just like a community of household workers, but it done at a very low level of production. You know, I think it's easier to work bronze like that than say ceramics, which is a little bit more bigger production usually.
Yeah, you may be right, but looks like it was at the household level here as well.
Yeah, probably for there it was as well, yeah.
Because we kind of find the slag, you know, the byproduct of bronze making kind of scattered all over the place. You know, it's not really concentrated in one craft producing area. So it looks like this knowledge was pretty diffused through the community. It wasn't like some secret metalsmith knew the secret recipe. It was just not that big of a deal. Although we do find these bronze items in a sort of ritual deposit context, so they definitely had some kind of a, greater meaning beyond just being utilitarian. But that's kind of a whole different conversation too.
Yeah, no, I mean, the model he's talking about as far as the ritual, sort of secret craft you see in Africa with ironworking in particular.
Yeah.
But certainly the metal objects and some of those pictures you showed, there was the workmanship's very fine. Those arrowheads look.
Yeah, those arrowheads look beautiful. If you think of the casting molds, right? The casting mold technology that's involved. Yeah. And that was one of my arguments against the sort of mobility of these people, that, to produce something like that, I mean, you had to be sedentary, because if you're talking about heavy equipment like anvils, hammers, furnaces, at least a large part of the community had to be there. That's just not something you're going to abandon and kind of migrate out for the summer.
That's an interesting thought, because as you introduce bronze working technology, which probably did diffuse there from somewhere else, if you want to engage in that, you can't carry, if you're using, ceramic, or you're not going to probably be carrying those around if you can avoid it, and so that may be an encouragement to become more sedentary, not for intensive agriculture, but for some of these crafts, the ceramics and the bronze working may have encouraged these small settlements like that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think we're out of time, but I'm not sure, right? Do we end at 8?
Oh, yeah. So we can stay on if you want, or you can go. It's up to you, and we can deal with anyone who wants to stay on and talk a little bit.
Yeah, we can stay on. I'm fine with that.
The class is excused. For those who might be watching on the live stream, thank you. We'll be on a little bit if you want to send questions. Do it really quick before Shaklo signs off. She'll leave us soon, and she relays the questions, or you can send them at a later time. So from the class, I want to thank you, Denis, and like I said, I'll stay on, and anyone else wants to stay on for a little bit, we can continue the discussion.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Gregory, I think Gregory, yeah. You get the clapping